Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the show, head over to patreon.com/wellnesswithjer. We're a tiny little podcast talking about mental health, so all the likes, shares, subscribes are super helpful. Today, I have a very special guest, someone who's a therapist, but also with a specialty that we haven't talked about yet on the podcast. So I am super stoked to have Kathleen Mack on the show today. Kathleen, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so stoked. I love having therapists who have been in the profession for a long time on, because I think that's a good perspective. But I'm also super excited to talk to you about your work as a death doula.
Cool. It's
So,
one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
yay.
I'm here for it.
I always start with the same question, which is, how'd you get into the mental health field?
Oh my gosh. I feel like there's probably a long answer for that. I think like many therapists, I had a lot of experiences in life with people who struggled mentally, emotionally, and particularly my dad, but other family members as well. And I think that I found myself fascinated by just being human, truly, and always tried to understand the way my mind works, the way other people's minds works. My mom always says that when I was a kid, I would eavesdrop and it would be so obvious because I would like stare at the people. It wasn't even eavesdropping. It was literally just staring at them because I wanted to know what they were talking about. And I wanted a glimpse into other people's lives. So I think I've always had this very natural curiosity, and then also witnessed a lot of mental health struggles, had my own mental health struggles as a kid, teenager, young adult. And I think in high school, I knew that's what I wanted to do, that I wanted to work in mental health, social services of some kind. And I did various different avenues of that before becoming a licensed therapist.
Yeah. So I don't want to jump just ahead to the death doula stuff, but I kind of want to.
Go for it.
Give us the Cliff Notes version of your career in mental health up into before specializing in doing the death doula work.
Sure. So going through other things I've done besides being a therapist, or
your work as a therapist. I know that the death doula work is a more recent thing in your career. So just share kind of that journey into how you got there and where that specialty popped up.
Well, as a therapist, I'm really drawn to the really deep, heavy stuff, right? So I work really well with clients who are asking big questions about their lives and life in general and the purpose of life. And certainly I don't come at it as if I know the purpose of life and I'm here to tell you, but let's explore this together. Like, these are important questions, right? So I've always, and just personally, I've always asked big existential questions. Maybe just like I remember being a kid and asking myself, like, what is all of this? Why are we here? Like, what are we doing? And so I've just always had this natural inclination towards understanding the bigger meaning of life. And so, and quite honestly, it was really a not a phobia, but a fear that I had as a kid and a teenager. I did ask those big questions, and then I had a lot of anxiety around death and dying. I would wake up in the middle of the night, I can remember, just with this stark realization that this ends at some point. And I was very afraid for a long time. And so in my own healing journey of working through my own death anxiety, I have really cultivated a fascination of the topic. And so as I've continued to work with people, like, I find that more and more I work with people who are dealing with grief, who are dealing with end of life issues, who are dealing with like existential issues. And so I then pursued a lot of training around that topic. So including the end of life doula work.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to give us an overview, Kathleen? This is a bunch of therapists talking about mental health. What are the specialties you've picked up? What are the things you studied in this journey?
So
Nerd out. And now is your chance to share all your nerdy interests.
Yeah. So I particularly like to work with trauma and grief, shocker,
Yeah.
and anxiety, but I see that as very much tied into both of those things.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and
like, were those things that through your schooling you knew you were interested in, or were those things that as you got into the profession you realized this is what you do well, this is the clients you fit well with who are asking these questions? Like, was that I'm drawn to this and I'm studying it so I can specialize in it right away, or was that as you got into the field and started working with people, that's what you realized?
Good question. I think I always knew that I wanted to work with the, excuse me, heavier stuff, if you will.
Sure.
And yes, took a natural interest in all things trauma, grief, death, and dying. So I was always pulled toward that.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
And so picking up some specialties, working in that, I mean, like, I graduated, and this dates myself a bit, but like, it's been 15 years since I was in grad school. Trauma was a thing, but it wasn't a
Mhm.
thing that we talk about the way we talk about it now in the profession. So like, as a therapist, having to go back and pick up those trainings, having to go and get those specialties that I was aware of, but hadn't, done any rigorous coursework around.
Mhm.
Was that similar to your experience, or was that a good school, good program where you had a lot of
Mhm.
background in doing the trauma work?
I would say that my expertise in trauma has definitely come from being in the field versus being in school, and that's just kind of how
Sure.
I am. However, I will say that I worked at Rogers Behavioral Health for a number of years, and
Mhm.
they have a specific, what do they call it? I think they call it something university. Anyway, if you're a therapist there, you can apply to be part of this very specialized training around prolonged exposure therapy, specifically for trauma,
Sure.
and then exposure response prevention therapy for OCD. And so I got to do that, which was incredibly helpful.
Mhm.
And part of that sort of certification, I guess, was a number of hours working, doing very specific, you had to do a number of specific things in order to finally
Yeah.
have this like certification. So I got a ton of experience with that. I got
Mhm.
to, Rogers has very specific trauma programming, and I got to work in that program. I got to watch the therapists in that program. I learned so much from them. So I would give a lot more credit to that experience than probably
Yeah.
my traditional school experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, do you so I'm a marriage therapist, so that systems thinking was my training, but kind of that deep, heavy work that you're talking about, like the jargon we use in the family therapy world is third order change. So first order change is kind of behavioral changes, second order change is systems changing, families or organizations changing. And then that third order change is like that existential or almost a spiritual type of work. So it sounds like that's really where you've always been drawn, and that's the work that you still like doing.
Mhm. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say so.
And do you put that out there for clients to find you about that stuff, or do people kind of find their way to you? You find those clients who want to do that work?
I have in on my profile I have my own website, bearingwitnessmke.com. And then also the clinic I work for, Shoreside
Mhm.
Therapies, has all my information in it. And if you read my profile, I think you get a sense of what I'm talking about. And I talk about spirituality as being something that I specialize in exploring anyway. And I do get a lot of clients who say that they saw that and that was part of the reason that they reached out to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's go ahead.
I also have one of the owners of Shoreside. She does little videos with each of the therapists. And in the video of mine, I talk a lot about death, or a little bit about death and dying, and some of the bigger picture stuff too. So I will have a lot of people say, like, I watched your video and I feel like I can really relate to a lot of what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Because like we can nerd out and be jargony, but that's not how clients find us or come to therapy. Like no one's like, I'm looking for that third order change. I really need a therapist who works in that.
Right.
So yeah, walk us through kind of the end of life specialty. When did you pick that up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you mentioned your website. We'll talk a little bit about that work you do specifically, but paint us a picture of wanting to specialize in that and getting that training to work with that specifically.
Yeah. I've been interested in working in death and dying for, I think, since undergrad. I remember taking a death and dying course, and the professor had said that he had been witness to like thousands of deaths or something. And I remember being 19 and just was amazed by that and just fascinated by that. Like, wait, what? You're comfortable with dying and you actually are passionate about it? Like, that was mind-boggling to me, because people up until that point, I felt like nobody really talked about it.
Sure.
And so that planted a seed, and then I went on with life. And I probably decided to do the doula training, I'm trying to remember, somewhat shortly after my dad's death in 2020. And that was just a really powerful experience. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into about that. I'm a pretty open book about it, but after my dad died, it felt like it opened up a little bit of a new understanding of life and death for me. And so I then sought out the training program that I did my death doula stuff through.
Yeah. So, I mean, 2020 is always kind of asterisk of that's COVID. I mean, was that like a loss, that not being able to do a funeral or not being able to gather with family? Like, was that part of that loss being so significant, or was that more, if you don't mind me asking, was that more the relationship that you had with your dad?
It's more about the relationship I had with my dad. So my dad actually died March 14th of 2020, and the lockdown started March 16th, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
It was crazy. It was just wild for all of this to be happening, and at the same time for me. And it turned out to be somewhat of a blessing, because I had this forced time off work because my kids' daycare closed. And that allowed me time to like deal with my dad's death, and literally and also emotionally and spiritually. But we did not have a funeral, but he did not want a funeral. So maybe we would have done some type of gathering had it not been COVID, but it was such a shocking time. It was literally the beginning of the lockdown.
Yeah.
And but my dad died intentionally. He didn't die by suicide in the conventional sense, but I describe it as passive suicide. He very purposefully stopped taking all of his medications and had everything prepared for his death, and basically told me that I was going to find him eventually. And we kind of knew that was happening, and he was deteriorating significantly, and he did not want any help that I had, tried to change his mind about years ago, and had learned to just accept who he was and what his process was, and just respect his wishes to pass. And so I kind of walked that journey with him, and it was painful, but also really beautiful. And it made me think about death differently.
Yeah. So was like being a doula on your radar? Was that a thing that you knew about professionally. I think a lot of people hear the word doula and think of birth, as that's kind of
Mhm.
what we have associated with.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the first time I heard of death doula, and I think it was shortly after my dad died, and I was
Mhm.
on Instagram, and someone I knew, not someone I knew personally, but someone I, like, knew, like a friend of a friend, whatever, and I happened to
Sure.
see death doula on their Instagram page, and I was like, "What?" It was like, "Oh my," like, I'm pretty sure that's meant for me. It was like one of those
Yeah.
moments where I'm like, I need to know everything about that
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
And so then, did some hours of Google searching, I'm sure, and stumbled upon INELDA, which is the International End of Life Doula Association. There are
Mhm.
several. I was really drawn to that organization in
Yeah.
particular. And
Yeah.
then I did the training in 2021.
Okay. And so for people who maybe only have that like doula as a birthing person or a profession around giving birth, like what is an end of life doula? What is a death doula? Like what does that mean for someone
Yeah.
who's maybe totally unfamiliar?
Yeah, the sentiment is really the same in terms of what a death doula does and what a birth doula does, and um, life going in, life going out. There's a lot of parallels. Essentially, I guess I'll break it down. So there's the way that I was trained. There's sort of three bigger components of death doula work, and I think it's important to say that you don't have to do all of this. So the way I offer services is essentially a la carte.
Hmm.
And there are a number of services that I can talk about. And I think it's most appropriate that people decide what they want, what pieces they want or don't want. Where there's other models I've seen used where it's more of a package deal. Anyway, so the first is doing life processing and a life review.
Hmm.
And that is what it sounds like. It's being able to talk to someone who is not your family about um, your, you know, how you feel about how your life has occurred, the
Yeah.
beautiful things, the difficult things. And you're doing it in a way that you may not share all of that with your adult daughter or your sister or your friend, even because they may have an emotional response to some of the things you're saying. And so the
Hmm.
beauty of this is that really objective, non-judgmental, open space to be authentic about your life experience. That also can include um, facilitating conversations with people in your life. So let's say someone is um, embracing the end of their life and there has been a strained relationship with someone that they would like to maybe repair or acknowledge. And I can help facilitate those types of conversations as well. So
Hmm.
that's really the first part. The next part is more around legacy work. So that includes a legacy project for people who are interested in that.
Hmm.
And what I specifically do are videos. So I have a videographer that I work with, and it's essentially interviewing the person in their home or in a setting that is most comfortable for them, and talking about what's important to them. What do they want to, what messages, what words do they want to leave behind for their loved ones? And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's kind of based on what the person wants to share, right? And
Hmm.
we determine together how we want this to sound and how we want it to feel and all of that. And then I'm also doing some classes around life writing. So that would be more of like a short memoir where I can help actually write that. Um,
Sure.
a legacy project can also mean a million other things, and we can get really creative about
Yeah.
what that is. But those are two examples.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I
then, oh, go ahead.
I love this I love this work. I love that this offering exists. I think like grief and fear of death, like those are still very pervasive in our culture. Like, um, you and I talked when we first met about this a little bit. Like, there aren't a lot of death doulas. Like, it's not a very big profession, and there aren't a ton of them. So, like, I think this work is so important because people naturally have a fear of things ending, a fear of that change, of end of life, of losing a family member. So, like, I do think all of this stuff is needed. Like, we don't have good structure culturally in our society on how to process death.
Mhm. Absolutely. I totally agree. Um, and I'll speak to the third part so that I don't forget. But the third part is the actual how you want, and this is maybe what feels most similar to birth doula work,
Hmm.
is how do you want your dying process to go, to be quite literally, and how can I advocate for that on your behalf?
Sure.
This is down to who do you want around, what setting, and obviously some of these things are within our control and some are not,
Yep.
depending on the circumstances. But what setting ideally would you like to be in? Who would you like to be there, if anyone? Who would you not like to be there?
Yeah.
Um, is just as important as the first question. What type of rituals, if any, or prayers or music or store, like what is your ideal death? And then I serve to be the advocate for that.
Yeah.
And again, it's asking someone to have that role who is not emotionally invested in you in the way that a family member might be,
Yeah.
and might have a harder time advocating or implementing those wishes.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, is there, I have so many questions. Is there a lot of end of life planning that happens? Like, are you working in conjunction with people for stuff like that? Because in my line of work, not specializing with end of life, like I see a lot of the intergenerational stuff, the families who lost someone, maybe the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, and like they didn't plan their funeral, they didn't plan a bunch of stuff, and now the family's fighting and squabbling and all these things that have been like functional for years start coming out. So I'm curious, like in my line of work, I don't see enough people even planning their end of life ceremonies, rituals, like the
Mhm,
logistics of it don't get planned
mhm,
very much.
mhm,
And then you're working on like kind of these emotional and
mhm.
meaning making things. So is there overlap there? Are there other professionals who do that work specifically that then you collaborate with?
So I haven't. Some death doulas will get into work around like a living, their like wills and paperwork.
Yeah.
I have not gotten into that as of yet. Maybe perhaps I will at some point. There are death doulas also, particularly on the West Coast, who will do a lot of the funeral um,
Mhm.
organizing per se.
Yeah.
So I don't currently have a lot of people in Milwaukee that I am collaborating with.
Yeah.
But I think certainly there's opportunity for that down the
Yeah.
road as this concept becomes more normalized, hopefully.
Yeah. The Midwest is always a little slow on
We're always a little behind. It's okay.
normalizing some of these things. I'm still, hence the title of the podcast, still fighting to just normalize going to therapy. Um, yeah. So I think this is all so very fascinating. So bearing witness is the name of is the website you mentioned. I love that concept of bearing witness, like kind of being an observer, witnessing somebody at their end of life, as they're looking back, as they're taking stock of things. Like, I imagine that's a very powerful experience for you as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, selfishly, it's such a powerful and beautiful experience that it is an absolute honor and privilege to be with the dying.
Yeah.
And I just mean that wholeheartedly. Um, I can't really even, it's one of those things. It's kind of hard to describe
Yeah.
what it's like. I mean, I'm sure many people listening have experienced maybe a loved one passing, and of course, I'm not saying that all passings happen in a beautiful way. Of course not. But it's really a privilege for me.
Yeah. I can also imagine it's so empowering for the people you work with to also have some autonomy in this process and take some ownership or maybe some authorship of this instead of feeling like it's this kind of out of control thing that is happening to you, but to be
That's
a little
exactly.
bit,
Yep.
yeah.
To have some autonomy, to feel empowered, and to feel like there is an outlet to talk about it in a very real way
Mhm.
versus often the discomfort of how talking about it may affect your loved ones.
Yeah.
So if that makes sense. So um, it's I think working with a death doula offers this really freeing space to
Mhm.
be however you are showing up in your end of life process
Yeah.
without having to worry about, oh, is so and so so sad, and
Yeah.
everybody else's grief and how they're coping and dealing or not dealing with it.
Yeah.
I think that's hugely important.
Yeah. Are there major differences for like what stage of life someone is in if they're doing this work? Like I imagine someone who's been ill for a while, who's in their, late 70s or 80s or 90s even, like that work is different than someone who maybe has a terminal um diagnosis in their late 40s or 50s. Like
Oh
is
yeah.
that part of your training? Is that like
Oh,
looking at that stage of
definitely.
life?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly different person to person, but an element of people who are on the younger side is, of course, grieving the loss of what they thought they would, what they thought they would have, and what is now being, taken away from them, or the loss of what could have been. And
Yeah.
it, understandably, you see that more with people who are on the younger side. Although I would say even people in their 60s and 70s, I think of that as relatively young these
Yeah.
days.
Sure.
So I think even then there's that sense of like, I thought I had two more decades of life experience
Yeah.
and grieving the loss of that. Um,
Yeah.
so absolutely, I mean, I think it's probably too much of a generalization, and there's some truth to, people who are older, 80s, 90s, have a little bit more acceptance around having lived for so
Sure.
many decades, having gotten to experience so many um, life experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. And then what does the work look like for as you're navigating some of those family dynamics? So you're working with the person at the end of their life, but I'm guessing you have to do work and cross paths and facilitate
Yeah.
conversations with other family members. Like, what's that experience like as you hold space for perhaps some conflictual emotions or some conflictual stories about that person?
I think that the answer is it's as varied as individuals are.
Yeah.
Every family system, as we know as
Yeah.
therapists, is unique and has its own language, its own way of functioning, its own communication style, its own um, wounds and
Mhm.
strengths. And so it's being, it's important as a doula to be somewhat attuned to that, of course, and sensitive
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
that, while also remembering that your priority is the dying person.
Yeah.
And that can get a little messy, as these
Yeah.
things are, right? Um,
I I imagine. Yeah. I mean, I somewhat, I don't know, desensitized joke, I've been doing couples counseling for 15 years now. Like November and December, all the work I do is about boundaries with family of origin. Like for 2 months out of the year, that's all I do because these family dynamics are so complicated. Not necessarily complicated in theory, but complicated in practice to navigate successfully. And so end of life brings a lot of that stuff to the surface. There are a couple, I think, major life transitions that highlight a lot of these family dynamics that for a lot of people who are conflict avoidant, like I'm from the Midwest, we're Midwest nice here. We don't like to do conflict. Like a lot of this stuff almost can get ignored or live under the surface until something like a death is kind of imminent.
Yep, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like the complex work, obviously. I mean,
I
I've
do
talked a lot
too.
about my ADHD and like when there's a lot of moving parts, that's when my brain is, again, it's not about me as the therapist, but like that's why I'm drawn to that work because my brain
Mm-hmm.
lights up with all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it is hard and there's a lot of big emotions. There's a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What in getting this training and offering these services and doing this work with people, what has maybe changed about your approach to end of life, to death and dying?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've certainly gotten way more comfortable myself, obviously, with, well, maybe not obviously, but I think it's a natural byproduct, where I, honestly, I think about my own mortality all the time. And I don't mean in a depressed or depressing way. I actually was just listening to a podcast and now I can't remember, but I can't remember what podcast it was because I listened to so many, but this woman was talking about the importance of thinking about your own mortality on a regular basis. And the point is because it provides a little bit of a different framework. So like if I'm thinking of a problem that I might have today in my life and I'm not thinking at all about mortality or the fact that life comes to an end, I am probably going to see that problem differently than if I remember the framework of my mortality. And it adds a different perspective to how I engage in my life's work, in my relationships. It begs the question: who do I invest my energy and time in, and what do I invest my energy and time in? And thinking about my mortality, the fact that it could be 60 years from now. Wait, yeah, I suppose that's possible. Or 6 days from now, it
Yeah.
helps me prioritize essentially. And I think that simply the exposure to talking about death, thinking about death, being with people who are dying alleviates a lot of anxiety, just like exposure therapy works. If we
Yeah.
face the thing we are afraid of, we get more comfortable, even if it's just getting more comfortable with the discomfort.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember
And
what
like,
the question was, but I think I
no,
am.
you did answer it. Talking about podcasts, we can't remember. I don't know if you ever watched the show Midnight Gospel. It's on Netflix. It's weird. It's an animated show. It's basically Duncan Trussell, who's a comedian. His podcast is then animated with like crazy, over the top, kind of trippy psychedelic animations. But one of the guests he has on, and I'm drawing a blank on her name. It'll drive me crazy. I'll put it in the show notes. But she's a death doula, and so like just talking through all this stuff that like the way that modern society avoids death, of the way that a lot of like the way we do funerals, and it's all very sterilized and it's out of the house and it's away from people, and all these things happen, like have made death scarier as opposed to making people more comfortable with it. And
Mhm.
so I just remember watching that episode and then looking into her work more and being like, it is so fascinating. It's not like a dark or macabre thing when you're working with death. It's a very like gentle and kind of loving, open space you hold when you're working with death, because it changes your perspective.
Mhm. Mhm. It's also really fascinating to understand other cultural norms around death, and
Yeah,
the way it's viewed is is really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I talk a lot about that with grief, and I almost always am drawing it in other cultures as some ideas for ritual and structure, because again, American culture is kind of funeral on Friday, back to work on Monday, and like
totally.
that's not how our brains are wired to process big emotions.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And so, and even for people who I think I work with religious trauma, so seeing people who have a family member who's maybe very religious or a different religion than they are, like there's a lot of conflict is too strong of a word, maybe like a swing and a miss for connecting some of that ritual where different people need to hold space for their grief differently.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's very unique.
Yeah. So, like what's changed like for your family, for the people who see you different, see you regularly? What's different? I mean, has there been a shift in that's noticeable to other people? Obviously, this work you do is very personal with the people you're working with,
Mhm.
but
About me, a shift in
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to ask my husband.
Do we celebrate the Day of the Dead more wholeheartedly, or is there, any kind of external
I
shift?
will say that, and for better or worse, my children seem pretty comfortable talking about death. And sometimes
Yeah,
I'm even like finding myself being like, and then I'm like, wait, what am I doing? I'm doing the thing that, but they
yeah,
very freely and openly, and I realize I'm talking about my kids, not myself, but it's just an observation I've had recently. They very freely and openly talk about death. Their papa Tom being dead. They're not afraid to use those words. They're not afraid to
right.
use strong language. They're not afraid to ask questions. They want
Mhm.
to know what happens to your body, and they're asking the big questions. And I think that this is a crucial time for me to facilitate curiosity and wonder about this versus shutting it down, because I
Yeah,
can see how parents do that. I can empathize. It is uncomfortable because,
right.
and I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but sometimes my kids will even say like, "Well, mom, maybe I'll be dead." And it's like, don't say that. I want to just
Yeah,
like shut it down, but I also don't want to send this message of like, we can't talk about that, right?
right.
So, it's definitely influenced my parenting,
Yeah,
where I try to have the door really open to that and just facilitate their, again, their own curiosity. I'm not telling them what to believe or how to believe or what to think. I want them to
yeah,
come to those realizations on their own. Um, as far as any shift in who I am, hmm, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I think
yeah,
for me, spirituality is really important, but that doesn't mean that it has to be a part of death doula work. So, I want to make that clear. You don't have to be a
sure.
spiritual person to want to work with a death doula. I personally am. And so I
Yeah,
think it has enhanced my feelings of connection to source or, spirit. Um,
yeah,
and I think that's the probably biggest reason that I'm fascinated by death, is because it, in my experience and my perspective, is like the closest we get to God, if you will. However, I think of it more as like source or spirit than
sure.
using the word God. And
Yeah,
so that's part of the privilege, is like being with dying people is like being with God for me.
yeah, yeah,
So I think I'm a more spiritual person. I'm probably less um, caught up or stressed out by like day to day stressors. I mean, I'm human,
sure.
but
Yeah,
um, I think I'm able to take a lot more with stride.
yeah,
I think that learning about death has taught me not to take life so seriously all the time. I am a pretty sincere person. I like to
Mhm.
do important work, but and I like to have deep, important conversations, but it's also a reminder of like, this is over in a blink of an eye. Like, let's
Yeah.
have fun and
Yeah.
laugh and let go of all these things we think are so important that actually aren't, or at least it helps me ask that question to myself. How
Yeah.
important really is this? And again, that's just having this kind of different perspective.
Yeah, no, and I think that's important. I see a lot of that with working with religious trauma where people are reshaping or leaving a toxic theology or a high control religion. And it's like, for some people, it's moving away from religion entirely. For some people, it's figuring out what was maybe good and healthy in there and what they want to connect with. And
Mhm.
so, like, we have a lot of these conversations around, like, if you thought heaven was the thing and now you don't think that anymore, like that changes your perspective on time and what you want to do with your time on this
Totally.
planet. And like that prioritization, I think,
Yeah.
is really important for
Yeah.
people. A lot of us
Yeah.
feel that like daily grind of like, I need to respond to this email or else, and
Yeah.
realizing that like we are on a rock that's spinning
Yeah.
600,000 miles through space and you shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Like that's a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good, I like to think about our values, where our value systems come from. And
Mhm.
so you mentioned someone who, believe is taught to believe in heaven, and then you have to earn your way into heaven, and you have to align with a certain set of standards and of behavior and conduct in order to do that. What I'm getting at is how freeing it can be to reevaluate where our value systems come from. And I think that
Yeah.
being in with the dying also offers that perspective too. Like,
Yeah.
maybe we are free and inherently good, and we each have our own inherent value system, and that may or may not align exactly to society's standards. And
Yeah.
um, that in itself is really cool work to
Yeah.
and to think about. So
Yeah. Yeah. I also like doing the third order work. So all this stuff is fascinating. Last question. You've been super generous with your time, and I appreciate it. Um, Doing some of this heavy work, whether it's trauma or it's grief or it's end of life stuff, how do you kind of take care of yourself? What do you do to manage and deal with, some of the maybe secondary or tertiary trauma that comes up with it, and some of holding this space that can be really heavy? How do you take care of yourself? What do you
mhm.
do to manage
Yeah.
that? And
Well, a couple of things, and I'll start with my sort of philosophy about it, which is that I um, do no good to the world by carrying or embodying the pain of other people. That now there's a difference between empathy and taking on, obviously, someone else's pain.
yeah,
And so I think I have established over the years a pretty solid boundary there. I don't have to
mhm,
put much effort into it anymore. Not to say that once in a while certain things kind of trigger you or get you are a little bit stick with you a little bit more than something else. But overall, I strongly believe that, my role in people's lives in the work that I do is, um, and forgive the hippie language, but to maintain a higher frequency. And I can hold your pain and be in the dark with you and also hold a higher frequency, because I don't
mhm,
think that it's beneficial to you or anyone else if I like come down with you. I hope that makes some ounce of sense. It makes sense in my mind, but
yeah,
so that's kind of the philosophy that I hold on strongly to. And then in terms of taking care of myself, I mean, mindfulness, presence, being with my kids. They are the funniest, goofiest creatures ever. And that is a huge help in terms of transitioning from the workday to home life, because they're like,
yeah,
Mom, Mama! And instantly I have joy and stress and all the things. A couple other things I do is I paint in watercolor a lot.
Mhm.
I mean, that's my thing. That's definitely that's right now my therapy. That's my flow state. So I do a ton of that.
Yeah.
Being in nature, um, nurturing deep connections with the people that I love.
Mhm.
Those are all the things that keep
Yeah.
me well.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for
Mhm,
sharing.
mhm.
Um, Kathleen, if people are interested in learning more about you, if they're interested in the work you do, or they want to with you, where can they go to find you?
Yeah, so I have my website again, which is bearingwitnessmke.com. You can also find me on the Shoreside Therapies website, which also has a link to my individual website, as well as I mentioned earlier, a little video talking about some of the work that I do. And then I have an Instagram page called Bearing Witness MKE as well.
Yeah. Awesome. We'll have all that stuff in the show notes for
Cool.
people, so it's easy to find. Kathleen, thanks so much for coming on. It was awesome to get to chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thank you for tuning in again this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.